what I want to get to now is the shift we are going to have to make with regard to how we hold beliefs so that we won't go to war over them any longer. I want to celebrate the fact that we used to, and admit that it is in fact what's made us what we are today as Homo sapiens. And that could be traced out in a 1,200-page book on the history of warfare and the resulting beliefs that came from it. I'm not going to write that book. This is at a meta level, this discussion. But what's called for really now is a shift in our whole relationship to beliefs. There's much talk of glasnost these days, an openness towards alternate beliefs. But I'm talking about a metaglasnost, which is an openness towards the status of beliefs themselves, finding a new relationship to them, taking your own personal identity from something other than your beliefs, defining yourself apart from what you believe, which we have never done, and which is extremely hard to do. Next time you have a fight with your spouse, what it will be about is your beliefs as against her or his beliefs. And to find the path which preserves the fighting, which is how we winnow among defective beliefs and find the next truth, to preserve that fighting and at the same time put a ceiling over it so it doesn't escalate and take its usual path all the way to violence between individuals or between nations. That's the challenge. It's glasnost not towards a different belief than mine, but a glasnost towards both your belief and my belief. It's openness towards a different status of beliefs in the first place. And with regard to that, science has a wonderful lesson for all of us. At first, for 1700, since the Greeks, up until 300 years ago, science went nowhere, basically. I mean, people now can point out that little things did happen, and, you know, if you want to make the case, you can point out a few things that happened. But basically, Aristotle looked into his soul and projected what he saw there on the natural world, and the church liked what he said because it helped them in their job of shaping societies. It remained unchallenged for 1,500 years, and it really didn't work. It didn't give people any power in their dealings with nature. I want to talk about two kinds of belief systems, or models. I'm going to use the word model a lot instead of belief, because a model is kind of a little system of beliefs that applies to something. And the models that come in two kinds. There are nature models, which deal with the world and biology, and there are self models, which deal with your soul. Aristotle's purported nature model was really a projected self model. And he said smoke rises because, I forget what he said about smoke, but I mean, it was basically, it was so anthropomorphic, you can hardly remember it if you've gotten used to thinking the other way around. And it was all very intuitive, and people bought it, but it didn't give them any power. Finally, in about 1600, a few people in England came up with a different perspective on things, and they did that by really separating nature models from self models. They said, for the time being, we're going to assume that men are different from everything else, that humans are different from everything else. And we're just going to describe everything else and forget human beings for the time being, and our models don't have to apply to them. The church's models can apply to them. Self models and values and all the church stuff can apply to them. But we're going to look at this other stuff out here, released from the constraint which Aristotle had placed it under, that everything had to be explained in one grand model, that human beings were part of nature. So by making this absurd assumption that human beings were not a part of nature, which now we have to correct, but only now, you can have a 300-year go at developing physics, and you can really get powerful by making this absurd assumption that for the time being our minds, our souls, our beings are not going to be described by these so-called objective models, self-models, nature models. Well, Francis Bacon started that, and others got into it and developed this peculiar way of looking at things as if the looking didn't have anything to do with what they were looking at. It's in fact the way most of us still look at things today. We forget that we are looking. We just look and we figure it is doing something. And we have indulged in ignoring the relationship between the looker and the looked at. Because we can get away with it. We can get very powerful theories doing that. The 20th century introduces a real important correction to that, but I won't get to that for a minute. Now I'm back in the 16th with Newton, and 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And this objective view develops, which separates self-models from nature models. It had been for so long assumed that your nature models didn't really make any difference, that when people began exploiting them at first, there's some very poignant stories of using some of the new theoretical understanding to build things like steam engines and putting them on a boat, and people simply refusing to believe that the thing worked and wouldn't try it and wouldn't support it. And as late as 1800, inventors of steam engines and inventors of steamboats like Fulton had a terrible time persuading a completely skeptical public, mired in the idea that material change was impossible, or in any case it was extremely slow. Suddenly there's this boat going up and down the river with steam, and people had what's called a Luddite mentality towards it. And Luddite is a name from England, of people who over there were the same, simply refusing to accept technological progress. And suddenly the dam broke, and people kind of switched and went from the assumption that nothing could change out in nature, out in the material world, to the fact that if things weren't changing, there was something wrong with them. If things were not modernizing all the time, if beliefs about these objects weren't continually being improved and the products being improved that followed from the theories, that then there was something wrong. That is such a revolutionary shift in consciousness, from going from the attitude that of a static assumption about the material world, which is only about 200 years ago, that was the way all our ancestors looked at the world, to our view, which is if the soap we buy isn't new and improved, there must be something wrong with it. If everything that comes out, if the next radio isn't a better radio, something's wrong. We expect continuous revolution in technology and in nature models. The first attempts to change nature models, the most famous ones you all know about, Copernicus saying that the Earth went around the sun instead of the sun going around the Earth. Darwin's Origin of Species, a whole new view of the origin of diversity in the plant and animal kingdom. That one still bothers a lot of people. Lyell's theory of geology before Darwin, and crucial to Darwin, Lyle, a British geologist, had a theory of the gradual formation of mountains instead of the instant formation of mountains. He saw in the geological record that it occurred over millions of years. This violated church doctrine. This went over very, very badly with people, and it was the first opening wedge in that door of going from static nature models to continuously changing nature models. All of that, however, was permitted because humans were not a part of nature, you see, so we could have the continuous change in nature models without jeopardizing our understanding of ourselves. We could stay the same on our comfortable religious traditions. Why nature spun on, why our understanding of nature moved, and we even finally accepted all the economic benefits thereof. We, human beings, had divorced ourselves from nature models, and we stayed the same. Now, it's manifestly absurd to separate human beings from nature. If models of nature are going to change continuously, then our self-understanding is going to change continuously. We haven't gotten used to that yet. We haven't gotten used to it on either the personal level or the social level. When there is a wonderful theory of physics and an experimentalist comes along and finds an exception to it, a good scientist rejoices because he realizes, aha, the old theory is dead, long live the new, and gets busy and tries and figures out the new theory. But when an inconsistency is pointed out in human behavior, in one's own behavior, or when an inconsistency is pointed out by the Russians about the Americans, we take umbrage. We don't rejoice in it. We don't look at it as an opportunity to differentiate our political models. I'm introducing this word differentiate now. I mean by that the creation of a successor model to an old model. So Newton's theory of gravitation was differentiated by Einstein's theory, which replaces it, contains Einstein's theory as a special case. You take Einstein's theory and you put in middle-sized masses and small speeds, it comes right back to Newton's laws and even looks identical. It gives the same results. It would have to, because Newton's law works perfectly for middle-sized objects of small speeds. But it fails miserably for tiny little objects or huge massive universes going at big speeds. Einstein works for the whole works. So far, Einstein's works for everything. But sooner or later, there'll be an empirical piece of evidence which will mean Einstein's theory is dead. And there'll be a larger one, a meta-theory, which contains both Newton's and Einstein's as special cases, and which works not only for those, but for the new evidence which we haven't yet found. Einstein himself said that the destiny of every theory is to wind up as a special case of the next theory. But not so with self-models, not so with beliefs about ourselves. The bifurcation that was made, the deal that was struck 300 years ago when we separated self-models from nature models, has really left us, I mean, it was necessary. I'm not faulting history. It had to happen because people were too complicated to make models of in those days, and they still are. But all we had was these intuitive guesses about human nature. When Freud began actually trying to make a model of the mind, it was really a very daring thing to do and met with enormous resistance, even more than Darwin's theory. And it still is a very doubtful theory. It needs a lot of work. So I think it's a good time to take a break, and where I've gotten to is to essentially the idea that people are not separate from nature, and that if nature models are changing night and day, people models, self-models are going to too, and can we learn somehow to live with that and relish the discrepancies and attack them with a kind of scientific objectivity about ourselves, and at the same time not become a bunch of wimps who just gloss over and compromise human differences. That won't work at all. So there has to be a very tough-minded way where we can deal as ruthlessly with human inconsistency as we do with scientific inconsistency, but where our egos aren't involved, where we don't feel annihilated and that we have to, or that we involuntarily revert to violence to cover up the feelings which are engendered by an attack on our precious belief.